Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Smartest Mobility Opportunities in the Smart City. My name is Chris Robinson. I'm a senior analyst here at Lux, and I'll be moderating today's session. Our speaker will be Chad Goldberg. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box in your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all of the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond. At this point, I'd like to introduce Lux Research's Chad Goldberg.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to speak with you on the smartest mobility opportunities in the smart city. Now, as a research associate on our Future of Mobility team, I've spent the last 6 months or so speaking with and listening to interviews with industry executives and municipal stakeholders, speaking on some of the opportunities currently presenting themselves in the smart city mobility landscape. Now, the aim of those conversations was to sort of get a better understanding of what that current landscape looks like, some of the solutions that they are looking to implement currently and in the near future to solve some of the emerging challenges that are affecting the mobility landscape in smart cities of the future. And the conversation today, hopefully, actually by the end of it, it will give you a sort of framework to assess some of the greatest challenges that are afflicting those landscapes and offer some technology solutions that that some maybe will be interested in deploying to solve those. And we're going to approach this conversation by touching on 3 key segments. The first is going to be an overview of some of those current challenges in those urban settings. The second is going to be a sort of taxonomy, or maybe more appropriately, a simple overview of the technologies in that landscape that offer the most promise at this time. And then lastly, we're going to give you some examples of failures and successes of deployments in that space, and provide a framework for how you can assess going forward the best ways to approach implementing those with the smart cities of the future. But first, let's talk about some of the emerging challenges currently existing in those urban settings that are driving innovation within the mobility sector. Now, I think for many of you who are exposed to or have experience with urban settings, it's no secret that rapid population growth and urbanization are leading contributors to some of this push for innovation in the mobility sector. So by 2050, in the next 30 years, the world population is expected to increase by close to 2 billion people. And while that may not necessarily be too surprising, what really comes into play is the number of those living in urban populations. And that number is expected to grow by more than 2 billion people. And that's going to expectedly lead to an increase in residents traveling and the need for infrastructure to support those residents commuting in those environments. Now, that's ultimately going to lead to increased congestion costs, which is the yearly value of delay time and wasted fuel by all vehicles in those urban settings. Now, a study by the US Department of Transportation currently slates the total US congestion costs at close to $179 billion. And that number in the next 5 years is expected to increase to nearly $240 billion, with an increase in traffic delays of up to 10 billion hours, an increase in wasted fuel of 3.6 billion gallons, and an increase in wasted time per commuter of 62 hours, which for a little benchmark is equivalent to roughly 8 days of vacation. So individual commuters are going to spend on average 8 days of vacation in their car sitting in traffic by 2025. Now, of course, with those increased travelers on the road and pedestrians walking those streets, there's going to be a growing concern for safety of those commuters. And a study by the World Health Organization shows us what some of those traffic fatalities per year by country are currently looking like. And for the European Union, it's hovering right around 23,000, with the United States coming in at 48,000, and China has a staggering 260,000 per year killed in what could be ultimately avoidable traffic fatalities. So looking at these quantitative measures, it's clear to see that there's going to be an increased focus on safety for smart cities of the future. And cities aren't just sitting back and watching this happen. They're currently looking for ways to solve these problems, and they're doing that a few different ways. They're one, looking at improving infrastructure that in many cases haven't been improved in decades in some cases. They're looking to responsibly audit and allocate their resources as in the case of budgets. And they're looking to integrate novel business models, as well as making sure that all stakeholders completely understand the risks of not capitalizing on those opportunities. Now, it's important to understand that these opportunities exist throughout the smart city landscape and value chain, and that spans across the 4 key tenets of the smart city that Lux has previously defined, which includes resource use and efficiency, digitization, governance, and mobility, which of course is what the focus of today's conversation will be on. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, what's different now? You know, smart cities have been in the picture, it seems, quite some time, yet little has come to fruition. And we believe there's never been a better time to capitalize on these opportunities, as synergies brought about by technological and social readiness across these 4 themes are making the market ripest it's been for stakeholders up and down the value chain to step in and grab a piece of that pie. And ample opportunities exist for anyone looking to get involved. But in order to understand what these opportunities are, let's first take a look at how Lux has chosen to taxonomize smart city mobility, or rather lay out what sort of make it a little clearer what these opportunities are in this existing convoluted landscape. Now, let's take a step back and first understand what the purpose of mobility within these urban environments is. And that ultimately, at its most basic level, is to move people, move things, and of course, you can't effectively move those people or things without underlying infrastructure that is dedicated to do so. So let's first take a look at what moving people in the context of smart city mobility innovation looks like. And when we talk about moving people, what we're really looking at are models that are competing with conventional car ownership. And in the case of this context, we're looking at mobility services and traditional public transit. Now, we're going to first assess the mobility services space, which includes ride hailing, car sharing, mobility as a service, and micromobility. And we're going to compare innovation interest of these technologies by using the Lux Tech Signal, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And for those who are not, a quick background: Lux has developed a way to measure innovation momentum and technology trajectory by ingesting a few different data sets, which includes funding and patent information, as well as proprietary data that we use to provide benchmarks and composite scores to compare these technologies within and across sectors. Now, the key takeaway from this innovation interest graph for mobility services is there's been consistent innovation interest among mobility services over the last decade or so, which is largely due to the increase in digital infrastructure and the emergence of novel business models that ultimately made way for the sharing and gig economy. And looking at the current competitive landscape of the mobility services space, it's quite clear that the space is relatively full, and that contributes to a higher barrier to entry than even 1 or 2 years ago. And you're likely to see the main players in the space continue to expand, and M&A activity will likely increase as well, as ride-hailing, micromobility, and car-sharing technologies are well established in this space. But Lux does believe the largest interest in competition will come from the mobility as a service space, as cities are increasingly looking for ways to integrate all of these services into single-use, intuitive applications. Now, you can't necessarily touch on mobility services and moving people within urban settings without looking at the traditional mode of moving mass amounts of people in cities, which is public transit, the most equitable, affording use of transportation. Now, regarding innovation within this segment, it's a little difficult to innovate the business models based on the inherent nature of providing equitable access to these commuters. So when we speak of innovation in public transit, we're really looking at technologies that are innovating the operational expenses and improving those expenses for public transit agencies. And we're going to look at mobile ticketing, transit route optimization, electric buses, and personal rapid transit. And at first glance, it's relatively clear that innovation interest in the public transit space is more fragmented than mobility services. But we can still pick out a few key details, and one of those being that digital technologies still leads the way thanks to the recent inclusion of enabling infrastructure. As well as the sort of inexpensive nature of implementing some of these digital solutions like route optimization and the need for mobile ticketing services in today's day and age. Lux does expect that the electric bus segment will gain much more momentum in the coming years, however, based on growing adoption of technology as cities focus more on decarbonization efforts and charging infrastructure and technology readiness improves. And the public transit space is noticeably less populated than the mobility services one, and that can sort of be attributed to legacy suppliers that actively are engaged in M&A in this space, which make the barrier to entry fairly high for startups. And additionally, there's a known slower rate of development and technology deployment in the public sector, as limited budgets don't necessarily make it an appealing market for private suppliers. But that, of course, is growing as the need for these technologies increases. And we'd specifically like to highlight a startup or fairly established company at this stage, which is Via Transportation, which is traditionally a transportation network company with its core technology supporting microtransit within communities and organizations. Now, why they're interesting to Lux is that they recently found a way to integrate their core route optimization technology with the New York City school bus system, which highlights a great example of how some of these mobility services and companies and technologies have ample opportunity to serve multiple use cases and applications within the moving people segment. So we've touched on the known use case of moving people within these urban environments. Now let's look at a segment that's noticeably increasing and additionally will increase with the rapid urbanization in the coming years. And that is the need to move these things efficiently and effectively. And for that, we're looking mainly at automated delivery within the moving things space, which includes wheeled robots, legged robots, delivery drones, and autonomous vehicles. Now, what's notable here is that there's clearly interest across the board for companies looking to exploit opportunities in last mile delivery, and all types of automated delivery technologies have seen massive growth in innovation interest over the years. So let's take a look at what the industry competitive landscape currently looks like, and it may be somewhat surprising to some, as the most mature technology of the bunch is delivery drones with the largest number of players, while wheeled robots and autonomous vehicle delivery companies have similar numbers of serious market contenders. But referencing the results of the tech signal, where autonomous vehicles led the charge, it's actually in line with how Lux views the near and midterm market opportunity, as Lux predicts autonomous parcel deliveries will generate more than $33 billion in revenue in 2030. But specifically, we'd like to first highlight Nuro, which is an unmanned vehicle delivery company for last mile operations. And why this company is interesting is not only because it has raised nearly $1 billion to date from some notable investors like SoftBank. It's because the company has already showed promise with multiple of its pilots in cities like Tucson, Arizona, and Houston, Texas, where they've partnered with local grocery stores to deliver groceries to local community members. And Lux specifically expects these use cases for these types of road approved last mile delivery vehicles will continue to increase and ultimately be a staple to moving things in cities of the future. Now, we touched on the need to move people and the increased and growing need to improve the efficiency of moving things. Now, we can't necessarily talk about those without looking at the underlying infrastructure that supports the movement and stationary nature of moving people and moving things. So for this, we're specifically speaking on parking infrastructure, curb space management systems, and intelligent transportation system technologies. And for this first quick segment, we're going to look at automated parking systems within the parking infrastructure space, parking space management, and vehicle protection. And we're also going to include the curb space management systems, which is typically composed of digital curb management solutions. And we've chosen to consolidate the parking and curb space management into a single tech signal for brevity and simplification purposes. Now, there's been consistent innovation interest across the infrastructure category with relatively similar composite scores, which is an indication of a few things: that cities are increasing their focus on monetization of curbside assets, and that can be supported by the conversations and interviews that we have had and listened to. And that's supportive of the growing concern that city curbside is the most underutilized and under-monetized asset in urban settings. So Lux expects these scores will continue to increase as cities are now realizing the importance of effectively managing these assets that they have full control over. So smart cities of the future will ultimately feature a combination of dynamically priced curbsides and smart parking solutions that allow for easier monitoring of scarce parking and curb space assets, and enable more effective fare collection and parking enforcement. Now, the current competitive landscape differs from parking to curb space solutions, as one can possibly tell. While this by no means is an exhaustive list, the smart parking solution space is fairly massive compared to curb space management, as many solutions exist to offer the same type of service, or rather many offer different sensing solutions to solve the same problem. So the industry is rather fragmented, and players will benefit most based on timely market entry and effective product market fit. So curb space management, on the other hand, is still a nascent industry, with a few key players still looking to offer the most effective solutions for problems that many municipalities and stakeholders do not necessarily know the extent of, or how to properly address them yet. So Lux does expect this space to continue to grow in interest and players as cities polish their curb management strategies. So parking infrastructure and curb space management typically take care of the management of stationary mobility assets, while intelligent transportations refers to the efficient movement of those assets on highway networks and city networks. So we're specifically referencing vehicle navigation systems, traffic control systems, variable message signs, and traffic sensing systems. And looking at innovation interest in ITS technologies, there's really not too much to say other than ITS solutions have seen extreme increases in innovation interest in the last decade, and Lux expects that interest will continue to grow as digital and connected technologies and vehicles continue to mature. And here we highlight a few of the key main players in the ITS space. A few I'm sure you're well familiar with, and some you may not know as well. But the landscape inherently has a high barrier to entry for startups, as the market's occupied by a few key legacy players in each market that engage in quite a bit of M&A to maintain that market share and relevance. But some of these companies and startups like Via, TTS, and RapidFlow, they find novel ways to integrate their products into the market and support cities and commuters in new ways. And specifically, we'd like to highlight TTS, which is Traffic Technology Services, which is a notable leader in the V2X space that currently partners with the likes of BMW, Kia, Continental, and Audi, and has already established multiple networks of vehicles connected to traffic signals that helps inform drivers with the use of data from surrounding traffic lights that ultimately improves the expectations of travel time, as well as relieves some of the stress associated with travel time. And the company hopefully intends to control the signal based on traffic volume and location of vehicles in the near future. So in the first act, we outlined clear motivations for smart city development, and the second segment offered a way to taxonomize mobility-specific smart city innovations. But how are cities identifying what solutions to pursue, and what's front of mind in today's market? Well, for that answer, we looked to some of the conversations that we had, and through those conversations, we gained a better understanding of some of the important factors that the cities engaged in smart city development are focused on, and we grouped common themes from these conversations that ultimately make up two specific factors. The first is cost, which is likely not incredibly surprising, but is comprised of a few key ideas, and those are budget constraints, high-value stackable solutions that can ultimately be used for multiple applications, and making sure that some of these solutions and pilots have a clear ROI before deploying. And the next is the importance of collaboration amongst all stakeholders in the procurement process. And ideally, communication exists as early on in the process as possible, and for all stakeholders to understand the unique needs of each city, as well as when looking to deploy digital solutions, making sure that those solutions are heavy and data rich inherently. So first, we'd like to offer up some examples of failures and successes that look to deploy innovations that are cost effective and have a measurable ROI. And we're first going to point to the example of Alphabet Sidewalk Labs. So Google's parent company proposed in 2017 to make Toronto's waterfront into a 12-acre smart city landscape composed of high-tech amenities. Now, the failure of this was that the project was effectively called off at the beginning of 2020 as citizens failed to see the benefit and were concerned about data privacy and what the purpose of the project ultimately was. Now, it's important to note that a multitude of problems likely contributed to the canceling of the project, but the lack of clear communication to community members of the benefits likely contributed a large proportion of the disappointing ultimatum of canceling the project. Now, we can pair that failed smart city project with the example of the city of Quincy, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. And that city was specifically looking to solve the problem of outdated traffic signals and congested road networks that were unfit to accommodate the increasing city traffic. So the city specifically was looking for an ITS solution that would be able to dynamically control its traffic signals to better improve the flow of traffic in areas that needed it most. And the key point of that was it was going to be based on real-time current levels of that traffic. So ultimately, the city settled on a company called Rapid Flow, which was a Carnegie Mellon spinout, which leveraged dynamic traffic signal technology and ultimately offered to be a cost-effective integration that could be deployed and scaled as needed, and that would have a measurable effect on traffic flow. And in a conversation with Chris Cassani, who was the city's director of the Department of Traffic, he confirmed that the solution was cost-effective and allowed for gradual testing and scaling as needed, or more importantly, as budgeting allowed. So the important takeaway from these examples is that just because you have the ability to deploy and develop high-tech environments and solutions that would theoretically be likely to improve daily life, it's really important to identify and communicate specific problems proposed technologies like these solve, and be able to offer a way to calculate a measurable ROI on those deployments. Now, these next examples highlight the case for pilot partnerships that offer ample data and accompanying insights. So the first case looks at New York City's attempt to integrate mobile air quality monitoring solutions on municipal vehicles that could ultimately monitor air quality as vehicles traveled around the city. While the solutions offer generally acceptable data on air quality, the application itself wasn't necessarily thoughtful enough, as there were likely unequal visiting frequency to certain areas of the city that may cause missed data points. And additionally, the data collection was limited to the standard work time of staff and municipal vehicles, which ultimately led to intermittent data sampling. So while the use case may be appropriate, it may also suffer from problematic data continuity, which was crucial for getting insights about municipal air quality. Now, conversely, the city of Columbus was looking to implement a new digital curb management solution to assist with monetization of its curbside assets and improve traffic flow from illegally parked delivery or ride-hail vehicles. So it ended up piloting curb space management platform CurbFlow, which established a load management zone that could be reserved and paid for in advance. And the success of the service was measured by, it being used more than 19,000 times, during of which it was utilized by commercial users like UPS, FedEx, Amazon, as well as on-demand driver services like DoorDash, Grubhub, Postmates, and Uber Eats. So while ultimately the use volume was a success, it was the underlying insights from the data that will make future permanent installations truly successful. And that data specifically showing that future deployments must be more automated and potentially leverage machine vision systems and novel payment solutions in order to fully capture appropriate use revenue. So in speaking with Robert Farron, who was the Assistant Director of Columbus Parking Services, he highlighted that an effective digital loading zone program should have actionable data collected on an ongoing basis to effectively measure usage, productivity, and safety, which further echoed the importance of partnerships and deployments that offer ample data and accompanying insights. We then turn to the importance of collaboration amongst municipal and private stakeholders when looking to deploy innovative solutions. So we'd like to point to the now likely cliche example of early scooter pioneers that split-scaled operations and dropped numerous units on city corners during the early days of the micromobility revolution. Those operators did so mainly following the notion of asking forgiveness rather than permission, and ended up not involving municipal stakeholders and regulators as they should have, which ultimately led to ill will with those early pioneers. Now, we can then look at the case of Circuit, a ride-hail company that offers free rides in electric vehicles in participating operating areas. Specifically, we look at its deployment in Boston, Massachusetts Seaport District and its collaboration with a local transportation management association, which is essentially a nonprofit that's committed to collaboration amongst public and private mobility stakeholders. Now, before deploying in the area, Circuit approached the Seaport TMA to assist in advocacy and the local introduction of the company and communication of its value proposition for commuters. And in the company's conversations with the Transportation Management Association, it ultimately led to frictionless deployment, and goodwill ended up remaining between the company and municipal leaders after deployment. And in our conversation with Patrick Sullivan, who was the executive director of the Seaport TMA, he highlighted that organizations like his exist to support engagement, education, and advocacy between public and private sectors. And he ultimately encourages stakeholders representing both sectors seek out similar local agencies that exist in most cities in some form today. Now, over the last 30 minutes, we've discussed some emerging challenges in the urban environment driving innovation within the mobility sector. We highlighted that population growth will contribute to increasingly congested urban landscapes, clogging up transportation networks, requiring a greater focus on safe and environmentally friendly, cost-effective solutions for municipalities. We also touched on how Lux believes you should be taxonomizing the market and offered examples of technologies that are being deployed and what cities are specifically focusing on when determining viable partners and attractive solutions. So I'll finish by highlighting a few of the key takeaways you should be thinking about when considering engaging with municipal stakeholders for smart city deployments. And the first, of course, is collaboration is key. You're never going to develop or deliver a product without first coordinating with cities. And our conversations with municipal stakeholders and insights from industry have confirmed this over and over. So it stands to reason that anyone interested in or currently involved in smart city opportunities must collaborate with local agencies and regulatory bodies. And the sooner in the process, the better. With point number 2, we return to the idea that city budgets are notoriously lean, and you introduce a global pandemic and you have cities barely scraping by, with many likely required to put projects on hold. So it's important to understand the financial position of local stakeholders and clearly demonstrate how you'll save them money. If given the opportunity to make a case for a potential technology or service integration, be quite sure to make it clear that your solution will ultimately support municipal operations, and in the case that projects remain too expensive, consider unique payment schemes that will enable city development and earn rapport amongst partners. Additionally, consider exploring X as a service or something as a service business models that may offer more flexible opportunities to work with cities with tight budgets. And lastly, be sure to leverage digital innovations that carry ample data-rich solutions in order to solve some of these key problems. So for companies involved in the digital technology space, it's important to first identify specific problems within initial target operating areas, deploy those technologies, monitor how well the solution addresses the problem, and then expand to additional markets in a similar way. Companies can ultimately get stuck assuming that just because their solution works well in a specific market, they will automatically translate to a seemingly similar market without properly vetting product market fit. So each city and subsectors within cities have unique needs, and it's important to clearly identify and address those needs appropriately across markets.
All right, thank you, Chad. We'll now be taking questions that you guys might have on the presentation. And as a reminder, you can type those into the question box. If we don't get your questions to this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar to follow up. So we are getting a few questions incoming right now. I think, Chad, may be a good place to start. We had a couple questions about curb space management, specifically just asking you to elaborate and maybe provide some examples of what curb space management is.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. You know, that was my fault for simply assuming that you know, that it's a well-established enough environment, but I guess based on the current nature, it's not necessarily. It's just starting to be more focused on. So curb space management is ultimately the effective monetization and management of really any curbside within the city's limits. And specifically for digital curb management solutions, cities are focused on looking to collect the most that they can out of those curbs. And one way they do that currently is with metered parking. So the problem with metered parking and current smart parking within cities is many people still find a way to skip out on that payment. So cities are actually losing millions of dollars a year to people that are illegally parking and banking on the fact that they can get away from meter maids and not paying those maids. So especially during the global pandemic, a key focus when people wasn't necessarily using that curb space for parking revenue was that cities were focusing on how to effectively monetize that curb with some commercial drivers. So they were looking at ways to allocate that to digital applications for companies to reserve in advance and then pay for that curb so that those cities wouldn't ultimately lose out on that revenue. So I think in the most simplest of form, it's curb space management is the effective managing of curb assets, which is the largest asset and controlled asset of a city that they can monetize, and looking at ways that they can effectively do that, and specifically nowadays with digital applications. So whether that's a combination of you know, dynamically priced parking models combined with commercial delivery availability for reservation, it's yet to be seen, and cities are really going to need to continue piloting with specific technologies and looking at ways to solve their specific use cases before they can determine an effective way to do that. And that sort of goes back to the idea that there's not going to be one size fits all solution for each city. You know, each city has its own unique DNA and fabric, and they're going to need to assess what's ultimately right for them.
And I think a good follow-up to that question that came in was related to some of the data we shared around innovation interest in the tech signals. So the question was, you know, why is interest in parking infrastructure and curb space management, you know, why is that shown traditionally lower scores than something like mobility services? Yeah,
that's actually a great question, and I'm impressed someone caught that. So For one, I don't necessarily think for curb space management specifically that the Lux tech signal should be relied upon extensively to sort of show that innovation interest. And I say that for a few reasons. One is that those solutions are inherently software heavy. So limiting the patentability, which ultimately drives a good amount of the innovation scores. So secondly, there are currently not too many players engaged in that space. So with that, there are very few, if any, meaningful funding rounds that would be captured and represented in that score as well. So, there could be a few other key points, like a lack of clarity of appropriate solutions for companies to fully engage in that space yet. And it's likely more difficult to procure pilots and sell a city on the necessity of those solutions. So there's also existing solutions that work okay for the most part. Like I mentioned, some meters and existing delivery zones. So I still think we're really on the front end of that industry, and in talking with a lot of these smart city leaders and stakeholders, there's going to be an increasing need, and some of those companies are just now finishing up their first or second pilot. So I think in the coming years, you're going to see an increasing need and desire to implement some of those solutions.
Excellent. And as expected, we do have a couple of COVID-related questions come in. This one is, does the post-COVID world present the same or similar challenges that we've outlined? Or does a work from home paradigm, is that likely to impact or modify some of the changes that we've highlighted in this presentation?
That's a great question too. And I think really in the near to short near term, or the short midterm, excuse me, yeah, I do think that you're going to see a massive change in some of those tendencies of commuters to, one, continue to use shared mobility, their comfortability to get on public transit. I think those are going to be some irreversible human nature tendencies that we're not going to see go back. But I do believe in the long term, things are going to return to normal, and we're going to be in a place that's better suited to deal with some of those concerns as well. We look at the idea that smart city opportunities expand across the 4 key tenets of smart city. There's opportunities that exist in the digital space, that exist in the materials innovation space, all over the map, that I think we're going to start seeing introduction of new business models and new products that are going to help alleviate some of those concerns. So while yes, I do believe some of those actions by commuters and urban commutes in general are going to change, I think we're actually even currently seeing an uptick back towards pre-COVID levels of mobility and transportation within urban environments. You just happen to be seeing an increase in micro-mobility utilization, and you see the ride shares adopting with the introduction of plexiglass between the driver and the rider. So I don't necessarily see it being a long-term shift away from some of these ideas that we've outlined. I think more or less it's leading to an increased adoption of some of these technologies that were ultimately going to be integrated in the end in general.
And so we talked and touched upon the concept of using autonomous vehicles for delivery. We had one question come in. What are your thoughts around using autonomous vehicles as a solution for moving people?
Yeah, great. So of course, Lux views autonomous vehicles as an important part of the future of mobility as a whole. But currently, the technology readiness level, when looking at those 4 quadrants that I touched on at the beginning, which as a reminder was resource use and efficiency, digitization and governance, the technology is still not at a place yet for us to consider it a mass affecting technology in the short or even short to midterm. So what we wanted to do with this was present some front of mind solutions that are ready to be implemented in the near term from the point of view of cities themselves. So we'll actually be releasing a report on the viability of robo-taxis in urban settings in early 2021, which will hopefully quench some of that thirst for answers regarding using autonomous vehicles for moving people.
Excellent. And we also had a question related to kind of the concept of mobility as a service. And so I think this will be the last one that we have time for today. So we talked about mobility services like ride hailing and car sharing, and a lot of times today those are individual companies providing those services. So in the future within cities, do you see those services having to be part of a broader mobility as a service platform?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I think in listening to many of these stakeholders in city, municipalities speak, this is one of the most important and developing areas of urban mobility. So this sort of goes back to the market map and tech signal for mobility services that we touched on earlier. And the idea that car sharing, ride hailing, and micromobility are pretty well established at this point, and municipalities are now specifically focused on figuring out ways to integrate all of these new mobility services into single multimodal and somewhat often synonymize it with trip planner applications, but even more simply, single apps that have all available transportation options readily available to reserve and pay for. So we're seeing this done much more effectively currently in Europe and Asia with companies like Mass Global and Mobility X. But Lux does expect that some of these mobility as a service platforms will be the next major progression for urban mobility services. And I think you're going to see an increased need in that as people become much more comfortable with traveling in a post-COVID world.
Thank you, Chad. So that concludes our webinar for today. As a reminder, the slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email later today. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey in today's presentation. We do appreciate any feedback you might have, which helps us inform and improve future webinars. So once again, thank you for joining us and have a great day.